All right. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. My name is Eileen Reavey, and I am the National Grassroots Director for the nonprofit National Popular Vote. So this webinar is intended as an introduction to how America elects our president now, how we can elect the president in the future by national popular vote, and how we can make that a reality. So this is hosted by the nonprofit National Popular Vote, and our sole mission is to pass the National Popular Vote Compact so that the winner of the nationwide popular vote for president becomes the president every time, effectively making every vote equal for presidential elections. For those of you that are joining us on Zoom, please submit any questions that you have through the Q&A feature that you should see on your screen. For those of you that are on Facebook, you can submit your questions as comments and we'll be able to see them there as well. So with that, we're going to start with a little history lesson. So how does America elect our president now? Okay, maybe this seems like a silly question to be asking people just a few days after our presidential election that we just had this year, but we use the Electoral College, right? So on election day, you and I cast our ballots for the candidates of our choice, but the real vote for the president is when electors meet in December and cast their ballots. So that vote hasn't happened yet. So ultimately, 538 electors cast their ballots and decide who the next United States president is. So states are allocated one electoral vote for every representative that they have in Congress. So each state starts with at least two for their 2 US senators and one for their minimum US House member. So each state has at least 3, and then you add on one electoral vote for every additional member they have in Congress. So that 538 number total comes from our 435 members of the House, or 100 US senators, and 3 electoral votes that the District of Columbia has that they received through a constitutional amendment. So to win the Electoral College, you need 270 electoral votes. That's the magic number that we all were tracking on election night and the days after, is the race to 270. So that's because you need a majority of electoral votes in order to win the presidency. So who are these electors? They get to decide who the next US president is, and we might not know who they are from our state. So the Constitution gives the explicit power to decide how electors are chosen to the states. So specifically, it says each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So what that really means is the state legislature has the power to decide the manner in which our electors are chosen. And this is a power that the Supreme Court has termed a plenary, or an absolute power of the states. So how do states exert this power? Well, 48 states and DC currently award their electoral votes based on whoever received the most votes in their state on election day. So we refer to this as statewide winner-take-all laws. So how that plays out, if we look at California, in California, if the Democratic candidate receives the most votes in that state, the Democratic candidate will have all 55 of California's electoral votes. Same thing in Texas. If the Republican candidate for president receives the most votes on election day, then all 38 electoral votes are granted to the Republican candidate for president. So in 2016, if you were one of the 4.5 million Californians who cast your ballot for Donald Trump, or one of the 3.8 million Texans who cast your ballot for Hillary Clinton, your vote was effectively thrown out at the state line and wasn't really represented in the Electoral College. The state law said, nope, the other candidate that you didn't support got the most votes. So by law, all of the electoral votes are awarded to that other candidate. So state law is actually how we end up with these divergent elections where the popular vote winner is the Electoral College loser. So this has happened 5 times in our nation's history. 5 of our 45 presidents have been elected without getting the most votes nationwide. Most recently is what probably most of us are familiar with. Were in 2016 when Donald Trump won the Electoral College while losing the popular vote, and in 2000 when George W. Bush won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote to Al Gore. So what people will point out is that, well, looks like most recently it's denying Democrats the presidency. So is this, some partisan ploy that the current system benefits one party or the other? And really the answer is no, because we almost had a third divergent election in the past 2 decades. So in 2004, if 60,000 voters in Ohio had voted for John Kerry instead of George Bush, John Kerry would have won the state of Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College and become the president despite a popular vote loss just shy of 3 million votes. And, if 60,000 votes in one state sounds like a lot, just think how close the margins are this year that we're seeing. We're seeing that, 10,000 votes here or there can really be the difference that changes the election. Certainly that's what we saw with, 77,000 votes over 3 states being what swung the election to Donald Trump in 2016. So 60,000 votes having gone the other way in an election where 115 million ballots were cast. Well, that's a completely plausible scenario. So we almost had a third divergent election in the last 20 years, and one that would have denied a Republican the White House after he won the popular vote. So this brings us to the battleground state problem. So these winner-take-all laws, not only do they lead us to the scenario where we could potentially have whoever gets the most votes not win the election, but it has really serious implications for how candidates campaign and how they view the country when they're trying to win their election. So these winner-take-all laws effectively mean that most states are viewed by the candidates as decidedly Republican or decidedly Democratic. Before the general election even begins, we know how 38 states are going to go. And so ultimately, the general election campaign is not run across the entire United States of America, but is really fought for a small number of undecided voters in closely divided states. So states that just happen to have a close number of Republicans or Democrats. These are what we call swing states or battleground states. So if you look at the 2012 election and we look at where the general election campaign events were held, they were all held in just 12 states, and 2/3 of the campaign events were in just 4 states that year: Ohio, Florida, Virginia, and Iowa. In this election, 38 states were completely ignored, including 12 of our 13 smallest states, almost all of the rural states, almost all of our states that have most of our agricultural production, and much of the South and the entire West Coast, completely ignored in the general election. Same thing in 2016. In the 2016 election, 94% of campaign events were again in just 12 states, and 2/3 of the events were in just 6 states that were really deciding who the next president was. This year, we know that 96% of the general election events were again in just 12 states. Ultimately, what it came down to, the 2 biggest battleground states this year were Florida and Pennsylvania, which between the 2 of them were the recipient of 37% of all general election campaign visits. So battleground states have this outsized power because they're attracting all the attention during the general election. But the impacts of them having this power, it's not just about where candidates are spending their time. And maybe if you had the opportunity to shake a candidate's hand because they came to your town, it's really about so much more than that, about candidates not having to talk to the interests of people all across the country, and really speaking to things that impact millions of Americans nationwide, because those Americans don't live in swing states. So other ways that this impacts our presidency and the way that our government runs is if you look at federal grants. So this research was done that found that overall controlling for variables, including a state size and natural disaster relief funds, presidential election swing states received 7.6% more federal grants than safe states, worth about 5.7% more grant dollars. So this equates to huge amounts of money. So as an example, if Tennessee, right smack dab in the middle of the country population-wise, if it had been a swing state in 2008, it could have expected to have received 300 more federal grants for a total of $60 million every year for 4 years leading up to the election. That is huge amounts of money that could really go far in these various communities across the country. And it's not that where the dollars are going aren't well deserved within those states, but it's the matter that the federal tax dollars that you and I are all paying for are being able to be leveraged to help whichever political party is in the White House currently try and win re-election for their party, whether it's for the same candidate or the person that comes after them. They're showing this clear favoritism, and it's really having real implications to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars that some states are getting in benefits over other states. Similarly, highly competitive swing states get twice as many disaster declarations as their non-competitive counterparts. A lot of money comes with these kind of declarations. You'd think that they'd be based on, the state's ability to respond to the disaster. If there's a compounding disaster, if they had a hurricane earlier this month that they haven't recovered from, and they really need the additional help from the federal government, the amount of infrastructure that was impacted, or maybe this is a kind of disaster the state has never seen before. You'd think that all of those would be some of the most important factors that go into considering what states get federal disaster declarations. But when you break it down and you find that swing states get twice as many as the non-competitive states throughout the rest of the country, then you really have to stop and ask yourself, is this having swing states something that is working well for Americans? Or is it really something that is allowing some people to have this outsized benefit and power? So what does all this add up to? Battleground states get more campaign events, more federal grants, and more disaster declarations. And all of these things are a proxy for power in our system, and those states tend to have a lot of power. And we know that it goes beyond funding, and it actually goes into shaping policy as well. So we see candidates now proposing policies that are specifically geared towards winning over specific voters in swing states. If you want to look at a really recent example of this, think about how much fracking was talked about during our presidential and vice presidential debate. That is something that is absolutely important to a certain part of our population, but it was being talked about not because it's a huge issue for tens of millions of Americans that affects a lot of us, but because it's a critical issue in the swing state of Pennsylvania. Versus at the same time, you had this summer wildfires ravaging the West Coast and many Western states. And that wasn't something that was talked about during the debates because they were affecting states that we already knew how they were going to vote in the general election. Their electoral votes were not up for grab. If you want some other examples of this, we can look backwards and look at policies like No Child Left Behind. This was a policy, an education platform proposed by a Republican candidate for president, and was the largest federal action taken into public education in the history of our country. The federal government getting involved in something traditionally run by states, that's not really what you expect from a Republican candidate for president, right? But this policy was geared towards winning over education-minded voters, or moms, in the critical battleground state of Ohio, and it was in fact signed in the Cincinnati suburbs. And don't get me wrong, this is something that people do on both sides of the aisle. If we look at the Obama administration, when Obama was running for re-election, he had a federal tax credit program intended to promote clean energy. And Ohio companies got nearly 4 times the average that went to other states. So states that happen to be closely divided during an election year, they do benefit immensely from that. But the key thing to remember, especially if you're right now sitting in a battleground state thinking, "Ooh, this seems like a good system," is that battleground status is fleeting. And there's only two buckets you can really be in our presidential election system. You're either in a battleground state and your vote is highly sought after and you are hyper relevant, or you are completely out in the cold with the 38 other states of the country and you're irrelevant essentially in presidential elections. There's not really a middle ground at all. So states that are battlegrounds now, that doesn't mean that they're going to be battlegrounds in 2024 and that they're going to continue to have this power. If you look at states like Virginia and Colorado, they were battleground states in 2016, and we didn't talk about them this election cycle. It was a foregone conclusion how those states were going to vote. So when we're thinking about changing the system, we really want to think about what can we do to make people relevant in every presidential election and not just have to bank on, oh, well, maybe I'm going to live in a swing state next presidential election and I'm going to make myself relevant that way. We can't bank on that. We've got to make people make their votes equal in every election. So just as a little bit of a recap, so the state winner take all laws are how we end up with these divergent elections. And the state laws are what leads us to having, the popular vote winner being potentially the Electoral College loser. And these state laws that say whoever wins the most votes in my state gets 100% of my electoral votes, that's what leads to states being safe states and for the most part completely ignored, or battleground states because all of their electoral votes are up for grabs just because they happen to be closely divided between Democrats and Republicans in that election year. So winner take all laws within states is the problem that we are seeking to change at national popular vote. And so we can change these laws the same way that they were enacted, which is by passing a different state law. So that brings us to how we should elect the president. I firmly believe, and we at National Popular Vote believe, that whoever gets the most votes should become the president. This is how we elect almost every other office in the country, and it's time we modernize our presidential elections and make it equitable to make every vote equal for presidential elections for the first time in our country's history. Every vote being equal would mean that candidates would have to care about the entire population's interests and not just cater to the interests of swing voters in swing states. We'd break the system where candidates advocate for positions because they poll well with these small pockets of voters and only listen to the concerns of people in a handful of places around the country. And if we had a national popular vote, candidates would be listening to the needs of all Americans and basing their platform and their policy decisions off of that. So that brings us to the National Popular Vote Bill. So the National Popular Vote Bill would guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states and DC. This is a bill passed by states to change how they vote in the Electoral College. So it's a reform of the Electoral College. So by replacing states' laws that are winner-take-all laws with new state laws that say, nope, we don't want to award our electoral votes to just whoever gets the most votes in our state anymore. We're going to award our electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. And this bill only goes into effect in states when enough states have signed on to the compact that they guarantee the outcome of the presidency to the national popular vote winner. And how do you do that? You get states with 270 electoral votes or more committed to the compact. And then you know that all of those votes will vote as a block for the national popular vote winner. And because that's the magic number you need to win the presidency, you guarantee the presidency to the candidate who gets the most votes. So moving over to a national popular vote would allow our electoral system to reflect the true reality of what our American electorate looks like. The reality is we're a compilation of diverse people and diverse opinions who happen to live in certain states. When I cast my ballot on election day, I think about what's most important to my entire country, not just my state. I know I cast it not as an Oregonian or a Pennsylvanian, a Marylander, a Floridian, or anything else, but as an American. And I think that most people would agree with that. That's how they're thinking when they vote for president. And the National Popular Vote Bill allows that reality to be reflected in who ultimately goes on to sit in the Oval Office and represent the one office that represents all of us. So far, maybe you're thinking, okay, that sounds nice, but that's got to be far-fetched, right? But it's really not. Our bill has already been passed by 15 states and DC with a total of 196 electoral votes. So 4 states passed our bill in 2019. The voters in Colorado just approved our bill last week, which we're really excited about. You know, we won suburban, urban, and rural counties in Colorado. And we believe that this is the way we're going to elect the president moving forward. And we are hopeful that so many more states are going to sign on in the coming years so that we can make sure this is the way we elect the president by 2024. Because as it stands now, we're already over 70% of the way towards this bill being enacted. Because again, you know, we don't necessarily need a majority of states. We just need states with a majority of the electoral votes. So that 270 number. So currently we're 74 electoral votes away from that goal. So there are a lot of questions that come up when you're advocating for a national popular vote for president. It's never been done in this country before. So I'm going to go ahead and break down some of the misconceptions that people have and some of the preconceived notions that often come up when we're talking about moving to a national popular vote for president. So number one, this is a nonpartisan solution to the battleground state problem. This bill is not a reaction to the 2016 election. Our organization was lobbying for this bill a full decade before Donald Trump ran for president. And so this isn't a left or a right issue. It's an American issue that everyone can and should get behind because it's the one solution that's going to make every vote equal in presidential elections. And it's the only solution that is going to do that potentially by the next presidential election by 2024. And yes, this is constitutional. If you remember at the beginning, I talked about the authority for this comes from Article 2, Section 1. It says, and it's really the plain reading of the Constitution. This is all of the instruction that it gives to the states is that they get to decide how to choose their electors. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So this is constitutional because determining how electors are chosen is a plenary exclusive power of the states. Now, another question that sometimes comes up is, well, isn't there something in the Constitution about congressional consent and interstate compacts? And you said this was a compact. So yes, if you were thinking that, gold star. Article 1, Section 10 does say that congressional consent is required for interstate compacts. However, the Supreme Court has ruled that consent is only necessary for compacts that encroach upon federal supremacy. Now, it's our belief that this absolutely does not encroach upon federal supremacy because we are using an explicit power left to the states in the Constitution, and those states are exercising that power. Now, that being said, you know, we're a litigious society. We know that this, after our bill goes into effect, we're going to end up in front of the Supreme Court. If after our bill reaches 270 electoral votes, the Supreme Court decides to overturn over 100 years of case law and say that we do need congressional consent, that's okay. We will go and seek it at that time, and we'll lobby Congress the same way that we've lobbied every single state legislature around the country. So that's something that if it's decided we need it, then it's just the next step on our path to changing the way we elect the president. It's not something that would stop our progress. Withdrawing from the compact. So states are able to withdraw from this interstate compact. However, they cannot do so between a really important 6-month period between July 20th of an election year and 6 months later on January 20th of the next year, which is Inauguration Day. And so that time period covers a really important time period in the campaign. So it covers when the major party conventions meet and pick their candidates, covers the entire general election campaign, the day we all vote, the day the electors vote, when Congress counts the ballots, all the way up until when the new president is inaugurated. And the purpose of that is to prevent any state from trying to essentially game the system and say last minute, oh no, my candidate would have won under the old system. I want to withdraw, and so that my candidate becomes the president. That is not something that is possible with our bill because of the language of it. And this isn't something that's enforced by me or a national popular vote or even a secretary of state or a governor. It's enforced by the impairments clause of the US Constitution. And no state has ever in the history of our republic left an interstate compact without adhering to the terms of that compact. So it's just not something that would be really of a concern for them to withdraw during that time period. Another question people have is, well, do you mean that we could have it and then states could withdraw and we wouldn't have it in a future presidential election? Technically, yes. But I absolutely believe that once we get a national popular vote for president, the rest of the country is going to see how great this is, and more states are going to sign on. So we're really not going to have to worry about it dropping below, that 270 electoral vote threshold, because everyone's going to realize that this is a much better way to elect the president, and it's a way that makes every vote relevant. And really, any state that tried to withdraw would be almost disenfranchising their voters again by potentially making them people who just live in a safe state, as opposed to under a national popular vote, every vote is relevant no matter where it's cast. Another objection people have is often around the framers of the Constitution, the founders of our country. And I think it's important to note that when we're talking about this, the way we elect our president now is nothing like it was at the founding of our country. So people saying that, we're going against the wish of the founders, or they'd be rolling over in their graves at this proposal. No, that is just completely unfounded. If you really look at how we came up with the system of electors, after the founders came up with the concept of choosing electors, they debated how those electors should be chosen. They took 30 votes over 22 days on the idea of how the president should be elected. Not a single one of those votes was on this system where whoever gets the most votes in a state gets all of that state's electoral votes, the winner-take-all law. That wasn't something they even considered at the founding of our country. Ultimately, they decided to leave it up to the states to decide how the electors were allocated. They were the closest body to the people, and they were the best able to make this decision. So we're just saying, hey, state legislatures, we want you to use the power that the framers explicitly left to you to decide what's in the best interest of your citizens. And we're asking you to make your voters relevant in every presidential election for the first time. Another thing to think about if you're thinking how we elected the president at the beginning of the country, keep in mind that during our first presidential election, only 5 states even allowed citizens to vote for president in any form. And that definition of a citizen that could vote excluded a lot of people and was mostly limited to white property owning males. And it wasn't until the 10th election for president that a majority of states used winner take all laws. So the system we have now is not the system they designed. The structure, the framework of the Electoral College is what they designed, and that remains with our bill. But we're just changing how states work in it in order to achieve a better outcome for the American people. Another objection that comes up a lot is people think that the Electoral College is somehow meant to protect small states. But really, no, that's not a part of why it was designed. But the small states don't benefit under the current system. They're actually among the most disadvantaged group of states under the current state-by-state winner-take-all method of awarding electoral votes. And the reason is that because power in our current electoral system comes from being a closely divided battleground state. And if you look at the 13 smallest states, those with 3 or 4 electoral votes, 6 of them are decidedly Democratic, 6 of them are decidedly Republican, and 1 of them is sometimes a swing state. So The swing states aren't ignored because of their low population, and they're not getting outsized power or attention because of their low population. They're being ignored because they happen to be safe states. If you look at the 8 smallest states, those states that have 3 electoral votes, including the District of Columbia, together between the 2008, 2012, and 2016 general elections, they had 1 general election visit during that time period, just 1 among those 8 states over that 8-year period. In contrast, the closely divided battleground state, which had about the same population as those 8 states put together, received 40 campaign events during that same time period. Now, they received 40 campaign events despite the fact that they had 10 electoral votes to those 8 states' 24 electoral votes. So if the additional electoral votes that the smaller states had was really giving them much advantage, then we'd see people, the candidates, crisscrossing the country between Delaware, Hawaii, Rhode Island, Wyoming, and Montana, but we don't because those states happen to be decidedly Democratic or decidedly Republican, and we already know how they're going to vote. And honestly, you don't have to just take my word for it on this. The legislators in Hawaii, Delaware, Vermont, and DC all looked at our bill and signed on because they realized that their citizens would be better off under a national popular vote. So that's five districts, I forgot to mention Rhode Island, of these small states that have already signed on to our bill. And when we think about what a campaign would look like under a national popular vote where every vote is relevant, let's just think about what we have now. We have voters who are either hyper relevant because they're in a swing state or a battleground state, or we have people that their votes are effectively irrelevant because they live in a safe state. National popular vote corrects this inequity. And we know that candidates will campaign in all 50 states. They will have to go all over. You're not going to see this tendency for candidates to just go to one metropolitan area or the other because that's really realistically not where the people are. The people are all over this country. So people sometimes think, oh, they're just going to go to New York City and LA, or they're just going to go to California and New York. And this is a common misconception. But I think it's really important for us to look at the numbers on where people in this country really live. And when you look at it, if you look at the 100 largest cities in America, 19% of our US population lives in those 100 largest cities. Number 100 on that list is Spokane, Washington, with 208,000 people. So that's 19% of the US population in our 100 biggest cities. It just so happens that if you add up all the people who live in rural America as defined by the US Census, that is also 19% of America. So to win a national popular vote, you can't just campaign to the 19% of people that live in our biggest cities or the 19% of people that live in rural America. You've got to talk to both of them and the 62% of Americans who live in the suburbs that are evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. One more thing to note on this is that when we think about where candidates are going to go in an election, we've looked at where candidates go now in swing states. So within a swing state, every vote is equal and every vote is really important to that candidate because it could help them win that swing state's electoral votes. And if you look at the data for that, candidates go all over. If there was a tendency for them to overemphasize going to metropolitan areas, you'd see it there, but we just don't because the candidates go where the people are. And so under a national popular vote, they're not going to just completely ignore states where they could be turning out voters and especially turning out new voters. You're not going to just ignore the state of Wyoming just because it happens to be a state. It's got over 500,000 people. You're not going to ignore a huge electorate like that. At the 2000 election, if it had been run under a national popular vote, 550,000 people was the margin you would have needed to win in that election. So really, candidates are going to go all across the country and speak to voters everywhere. And they're going to be talking to a lot of people that maybe haven't voted for president before, because what we found is that in swing states where people know that their vote is highly sought after, voter turnout is 11% higher. So imagine the 38 states that currently are flyover states, they're safe states. If we all across the country had a minimum of those states increasing their voter turnout by 11%, you're going to have millions of more people on all sides of the ideological spectrum turning out to vote. And that is something that is good for all of us. And as I mentioned, we know that all states will attract attention under a national popular vote because they're just candidates are going to go all over the country. So the national popular vote would guarantee the presidency to the candidate with the most votes. So during campaign season, we'd be the united battleground states of America because every district would be a battleground. Every vote would be up for grabs and candidates would be trying to get the most votes nationwide as opposed to getting just on the path to 270 electoral votes in a small number of states. So under the national popular vote, every state, every voter would be politically relevant in every election. So I hope that you will consider getting involved. If you live in a state where our bill is not yet law, please take a moment to write your legislator. Just go to nationalpopularvote.com and you can put in your zip code and it will take you to a letter that you can draft. And once you put in your address, it'll automatically send it to your state legislator, your state senator, and your governor, letting them know that this is an issue that you care about. If you want to get more involved, please sign up at nationalpopularvote.com/volunteer. I'll get you plugged in with efforts in your state. And also, if you live in a state where our bill is already law, don't worry, we still can definitely use your help. We can use your help with phone banking when we have legislative sessions next year, when we're hoping to see action for our bill. You can help us contact voters, writing letters to the editor in your community and letting people know that this is a bill that is a possibility by the 2024 election. And spreading the word about social media. Just because you live in a state that's already passed this, you probably have friends and family across the country in states that have never heard of this bill and would be interested in it and just need the nudge from you to learn more about it. So I really hope that you will all consider getting involved.